Move it, city trash! Lauren Whitaker hissed, her shoulder slamming into Kira Thompson with enough force to send her textbooks skidding across the polished hallway floor. The word city spat like a curse that clung to the stale scent of overused floor wax drifting beneath the flickering fluorescent lights as a hush rippled through the crowded corridor, where every locker door seemed to lean forward listening. The silence punctuated only by the squeak of rubber soles twisting nervously against linoleum as each student froze in place, eyes wide and unblinking, watching the quiet black girl from Chicago who dared step into Ashwood High's unwritten rules. And when Kira's deep brown gaze flicked up for a fleeting moment to meet Lauren's icy blue stare, a jolt like a live wire zipped through the air, sharp enough to make a boy drop his phone with a hollow clatter that echoed off the metal walls. But as Kira crouched to gather her scattered notebooks, her hands trembling ever so slightly, everyone waited breathless for her to cry or snap or beg for mercy because wasn't that the script they all knew by heart? Wasn't that the performance Lauren always demanded as proof of her reign? Yet a faint whiff of burnt coffee drifting from the teacher's lounge curled through the corridor like a mocking reminder that even the adults were nowhere to be seen when it counted. And in that stretching silence, some wondered if Kira would break, just like the others who had come before her, or if this new girl carried a storm inside her chest, hidden beneath the thin cotton of her frayed hoodie, as she exhaled in shallow bursts that fogged the cold air between them. And in that same breathless moment, a quiet question sparked among the onlookers. Did Kira's silence mean surrender, or something far more dangerous? Something that could crack the perfect mask of Lauren Whitaker, who ruled these halls with a sugar-coated sneer and a single raised eyebrow. And as Kira stood slowly, her movements deliberate, her books pressed tight against her chest, the cheap synthetic scent of her backpack, straps stinging her nose. She felt every gaze prickling across her skin like hot needles, but she kept her head down, forcing her pulse to slow while Lauren stepped closer, her perfectly manicured nails glinting beneath the buzzing lights as she lifted one delicate finger to flick a strand of Kira's hair from her shoulder, the gesture casual but coiled with menace, her voice syrupy sweet but edged with poison. As she leaned in so close, Kira could smell the sharp chemical tang of her expensive hairspray. "You really think you belong here, don't you, city girl?" Lauren purred, the words rolling from her tongue like knives wrapped in silk, loud enough to carry down the length of the hallway, where each student shifted uncomfortably, a few eyes darting toward the exit, others raising their phones with screens dimmed, yet cameras rolling hungry to capture every flinch, every ragged breath, every tremor of weakness they might feast on later in whispered retellings, because this was the show they'd been waiting for, the opening act of a story that would echo through every classroom, every locker, every hushed conversation. And as the tension wound tighter around them, like invisible wire, Kira straightened just enough to look Lauren in the eye, her breath steadying into a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the drumming of her heart, a sound loud enough in her ears to drown out the hush that had swallowed the corridor whole. And in that long, unbroken stare, something flickered behind Kira's eyes, something ancient and unyielding that made Lauren's smile falter. The faintest crack in the queen's perfect mask before she caught herself and let out a low, condescending laugh, a sound that skittered along the cold tile like broken glass, but not before everyone saw it, the tiny shiver of doubt that passed through Lauren Whitaker's icy eyes. And as Kira finally turned to walk away, each footstep echoing louder than any shout she left behind, a hallway so quiet the whir of the overhead ventilation sounded like a roar in the stunned silence, a silence that held the unspoken promise that this year at Ashwood High would not go the way anyone expected. Kira could feel every pair of eyes drilling holes into her back as she walked down the narrow hallway lined with gray lockers scuffed from years of careless kicks, the cold metal brushing against her shoulder. With each careful step, a silent chorus of squeaks and soft gasps rising behind her like a wave threatening to crash, but never quite reaching her, as if the entire corridor held its breath, waiting for a sign of weakness. Something to confirm the rumors already starting to coil through the air about the black girl from Chicago who didn't know her place. And as she reached her locker, the combination lock felt sticky beneath her cold fingers, the faint scent of rust and old gum lingering in the metal cracks, a sickly sweet reminder of every moment she tried to keep her head down in other schools, only to learn that staying quiet rarely kept you safe. Her hands shook slightly as she spun the dial, but she forced her breathing into a slow, measured rhythm, remembering her father's voice, reminding her that strength wasn't in her fists, but in how she carried herself, and whether she could choose stillness even when every instinct screamed to fight or flee. And from the corner of her eye, she saw Lauren and her entourage, Avery with her perfectly straight copper hair and brittle laugh that sounded like glass, shattering each time Lauren smirked, and Marissa tall and quiet, but with a gaze like a hawk dissecting everything in sight, drifting past like sharks circling prey. Their footsteps synchronized a deliberate performance of their power, the soft swish of their branded skirts brushing together like whispers of disdain, while their eyes flicked to Kira again and again with each glance promising that the game was far from over, and a thought fluttered unbidden in Kira's mind. Would there ever be a place where she could walk through a school hallway without the weight of every stare pressing down on her shoulders, without the unspoken question of what she was doing here coloring every interaction, and in that moment, a sour metallic taste rose in the back of her throat, as if each doubt lodged there like a splinter she couldn't swallow or spit out. Her fingers finally twisted the lock open, the faint click impossibly loud in the tense hush as she pulled the dented locker door toward her, wincing at the high-pitched squeal of rusty hinges that felt like a spotlight, screaming her presence across the hallway. And behind her, Lauren's voice floated back soft but sharp enough to draw blood. She's so pathetic. I almost feel sorry for her. The words dripped with practiced malice, meant to slice without needing to shout, carried on the stale air, heavy with teenage sweat and cheap body spray lingering from the morning rush. Kira took a slow breath, placing her books carefully into the locker, each motion deliberate as though the simple act of organizing her notebooks could shield her from the eyes that dissected her every move. And with every scrape of a binder against the metal shelf, she felt the energy around her shift tighten until even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz with cold impatience. The hallway's ambient noise felt wrong, too loud and too quiet. All at once, footsteps near and far, echoing unevenly, like a heartbeat skipping in fear or excitement. And in that jagged rhythm, Kira wondered quietly if anyone had ever stood up to Lauren, or if every student had simply accepted that surviving Ashwood High meant staying small and silent, hoping not to catch the Queen's icy eye. And as the final bell rang, sharp and jarring, it shattered the moment like a rock thrown through a window, sending students scurrying into classrooms but leaving a jagged silence in its wake. The kind of silence that promised this was only the beginning. Not an end, because when Kira stepped into her first period classroom, the familiar scent of dry erase markers and industrial carpet made her stomach twist with nausea, as if each classroom she had ever sat in across 5 schools were layered over this one, each memory stacked like ghosts, whispering reminders that silence had kept her alive before. But at what cost? The teacher, a tall, thin man with a receding hairline and a tired voice, called roll without looking up from his attendance sheet, his monotone reading each name with mechanical disinterest. But when he paused at Kira's name, there was a brief hitch, a flicker of curiosity before he moved on. And in that moment, the entire class felt the shift, the subtle acknowledgement that there was someone new, someone different to dissect and judge. The hum of the overhead projector sputtered, filling the quiet with a low electric whine that matched the restless tapping of feet under desks and the occasional sharp sniffle of a student battling early autumn allergies. Kira's eyes swept the room, catching a few darting glances before they snapped away quick as minnows evading a predator. But none of it was fast enough to hide the discomfort that her presence had stirred, and as the lesson droned on about algebraic functions and quadratic equations, Kira could barely hear the words over the pounding in her ears, each thud of her heart reminding her she was alone, surrounded by strangers who saw her as an intruder in a kingdom that had already crowned its ruler. And the longer she sat there, the more the faint scent of old coffee from the teacher's mug and the bitter tang of fear in the back of her throat mixed into a nauseating cocktail that made her hands sweat against the smooth, cool surface of her desk. And she wondered silently if anyone else in the room felt the same heat crawling up their necks, or if they were simply waiting for her to make a wrong move to confirm whatever silent suspicions they harbored the minute the bell rang, signaling the end of class. The shuffle of feet and screech of chair legs across linoleum thundered louder than any lesson taught that hour. And as Kira slipped out of the room, she caught sight of Lauren leaning casually against the opposite wall, her arms crossed, her smile sharp and cold, her eyes glinting with a promise of more to come, as if she were a cat toying with a mouse, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. And in that chilling stare, Kira asked herself, not for the first time, how long she could keep up this quiet defense before something inside her finally snapped. The air in the cafeteria felt thicker than usual as Kira stepped inside a humid wave of reheated pizza crust and lukewarm fries, slapping her in the face the second she crossed the threshold. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long, uneven shadows over rows of tables, scarred with decades of initials carved by bored or desperate students. The murmur of conversations rose and fell, like the tide punctuated by the occasional shriek of laughter, or the dull thud of a tray dropping to the floor. But beneath that everyday clamor lay something else, an unspoken tension that prickled against Kira's skin like static electricity. The weight of dozens of eyes flickering to her, then away just as quickly as if afraid of being caught, staring yet unable to resist the magnetic pull of the new girl who didn't yet know her place in this unkind hierarchy. She kept her gaze steady straight ahead as she wove between crowded tables the squeak of rubber soles on the scuffed linoleum floor. Sharp in her ears, each sound bouncing around the cavernous room, amplifying her sense of exposure, and in the far corner near the window sat Lauren and her loyal shadows their table, a quiet fortress untouched by the chaos of clattering trays and jostling backpacks. Lauren sat poised, one elbow propped on the table, her fingers playing idly with the end of her perfect platinum braid, her blue eyes locked on Kira like laser sights tracking prey. And though Lauren's expression was placid, almost bored, the faint upturn of her lips betrayed the simmering anticipation just beneath her polished exterior. A low murmur spread across nearby tables as students began to sense what was unfolding, their voices carrying words like "watch" and "she's dead" through the thick cafeteria air. As Kira finally reached the end of the lunch line, she could feel the sticky warmth of someone standing uncomfortably close behind her, the scent of mint gum and hairspray filling her nose as Avery's voice drifted forward. Soft and saccharine, "You sure you know where you are? Chicago trash." Her words slithered into the space between them like a knife, and Kira's breath caught for a moment before she forced herself to keep moving, fingers curling tighter around the edge of her tray as the lunch lady dolloped a pale glob of mashed potatoes onto her plate, the faint scent of overcooked chicken mingling with the tang of sour milk drifting from the open cartons nearby. And as she stepped out of line, she could almost feel Avery's smile behind her, the quiet satisfaction of a predator who had drawn first blood without lifting a finger. Kira scanned the cafeteria, searching for an empty table, but every seat seemed occupied by clusters of students leaning into their own whispered conversations, some glancing up just long enough to meet her eyes before looking away, as if the mere act of acknowledging her could shatter the fragile social order that kept them safe. She finally spotted a small round table near the far wall, half hidden by a vending machine, humming softly, the faint smell of stale potato chips and burnt sugar hanging in the air around it. She slipped into the seat back, pressed against the cool cinder block wall, feeling for a brief moment like she could finally breathe. But as she unwrapped her plastic spork and poked at the congealing potatoes, a hush began to ripple outward like rings spreading across a pond. Every head turning slowly toward the center of the room where Lauren had stood up, one hand resting casually on the table, the other gripping her tray, her eyes never leaving Kira's face. Each step Lauren took toward Kira's table was deliberate, the soft click of her designer boots echoing in the cavernous room, louder than the scattered conversations that fell silent one by one, until only the hum of the vending machine and the faint rattle of a distant air vent remained. Kira kept her eyes fixed on her food, willing herself not to look up, but she could feel Lauren's presence growing closer. Like a storm front, the air around her thickening with each footstep, until the shadows seemed to deepen, and the light overhead buzzed angrily as if the entire room were holding its breath. Lauren finally stopped just opposite Kira, her tray balanced carefully in one manicured hand, her icy voice cutting through the silence like shattered glass. "You know you're sitting at the wrong table, right?" Her words dripped with condescension loud enough to carry to every corner of the cafeteria, and a ripple of titters spread across the watching students. Sharp, nervous bursts of laughter that died almost immediately as they waited for the next move. Kira's heart pounded so violently she wondered if everyone could hear it, her spork trembling slightly against her plate. But she forced her hands to stillness. Exhaling through her nose in a long, slow breath, she lifted her eyes, finally meeting Lauren's gaze. And in that quiet, unbroken stare, the entire room seemed to tilt a fraction of an inch, as if gravity itself had shifted, a question hanging unspoken in the space between them. Would she stand or stay silent? Lauren's lips curled into a slow, predatory smile, her eyes glittering with triumph as she tilted her tray just so the movement, so casual it was almost graceful, before the carton of chocolate milk tipped over, spilling a wave of cold, sticky liquid across Kira's lunch. splattering her lap and dripping onto the floor. The sharp scent of sweet cocoa mixing with the sour undercurrent of stale cafeteria air. A collective gasp rose from the room, a sound almost musical in its synchronization. Dozens of breaths pulled in and held as they waited to see what Kira would do. Kira blinked slowly, her eyes moving down to the ruined food, then back up to Lauren, her chest rising and falling with each deliberate breath as the sticky milk soaked into her jeans, cooling her skin in slow, creeping tendrils. The cafeteria seemed to stretch out around her, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly, the buzz of the vending machine growing louder until it felt like a roar in her ears, and she wondered in that suspended moment whether giving in to the heat rising beneath her ribs would feel like freedom or defeat. But as Lauren shifted her weight, clearly expecting Kira to explode or cry, Kira did neither. She reached for a napkin, wiped her hands with slow, careful precision, then stood up, moving with a quiet grace that made the silence in the cafeteria press closer like a velvet curtain. The legs of her chair scraped softly against the linoleum, the only sound in the cavernous space as she turned and walked past Lauren, who stepped aside just enough to let her through, but not enough to hide the flicker of confusion that crossed her face. Kira's eyes never wavered as she stepped into the aisle, the chocolate milk dripping from her shirt, leaving a dotted trail across the pale floor, her steps steady and even as if each one was a deliberate act of defiance. And in the electric hush that followed, a question pulsed through every watching mind: what would it take to break this girl who wouldn't break? The hush in the cafeteria cracked apart as Kira's footsteps carried her through the aisle, the soles of her shoes sticking slightly to the linoleum with each step thanks to the thin smear of chocolate milk trailing behind her. Every pair of eyes locked on her back as if the entire student body had synchronized their breaths to the rhythm of her quiet, unwavering stride. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, casting a cold white glow that gleamed off the puddles left in her wake. And in that strange, suspended moment, the usual hum of the room remained broken. Every whisper held back as if the very air had thickened into something too heavy to carry. Words. Kira kept her eyes straight ahead, her jaw set, her heart hammering so hard in her chest that each beat felt like it might shake her ribs apart. But she refused to let her hands tremble, refused to let the heat rising up her neck flush into her cheeks and betray even a flicker of weakness, because she knew that's what they were all waiting for. The moment she would crack splinter like a piece of cheap glass and confirm the story they had already written about her, the new girl from Chicago, the one who thought she could stand in the lion's den without being devoured behind her. Lauren's icy laughter sliced through the silence, brittle and forced like a blade that had dulled from overuse, a sharp note that barely masked the frustration curling in the edges of her voice. She hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for the possibility that the girl, who looked so easy to break, would simply walk away without giving her even a taste of victory, and that seed of doubt rooted itself deeper in Lauren's chest, spreading tiny hairline fractures through the foundation of power he had built so carefully over the years. Students began to shift in their seats, restless feet shuffling under tables, a low susurration rising like the first stirrings of a storm, as eyes darted between Kira's retreating figure and Lauren's rigid silhouette. The stale scent of overcooked fries hung in the air, heavy as a rain cloud waiting to burst. Kira reached the exit of the cafeteria, pushing the heavy metal door open with a hollow groan that echoed off the cinder block walls, and stepped into the hallway, where the din of distant classrooms hummed faintly through the closed doors. Her breath came out in ragged pulls, each inhale sharp with the tang of disinfectant and the faint scent of old paper drifting from the library. Down the hall, she leaned against a locker, the cool metal pressing against her spine as she struggled to slow the pounding in her chest. Her fingers brushed across the sticky stains on her shirt, already beginning to stiffen into cold, clammy patches, and a wave of exhaustion rolled over her, so strong it almost buckled her knees. She let her eyes flutter shut, just for a moment, trying to gather the shreds of calm she had clung to in the cafeteria, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, a single question pulsed with relentless urgency. How long could she keep this up? How long before the thin line she walked snapped beneath the weight of every deliberate humiliation, every whispered threat, every calculating stare? But the sound of footsteps broke through to her thoughts, sharp, deliberate heels clicking against the linoleum like a countdown. She opened her eyes just as Lauren emerged from the cafeteria, flanked by Cassidy and Eliza, who hung back with uneasy expressions like wolves second-guessing the strength of their leader. Lauren's eyes bored into Kira's, their icy blue depths swirling with a storm of anger and something darker. Something dangerously close to fear, and she stopped a few feet away, folding her arms across her chest as if to shield herself from the possibility of failure. Her voice came out low and smooth, but it trembled faintly at the edges. Why don't you just go back to wherever you came from? No one wants you here. The words slithered across the space between them, dripping with poison and desperation. And for a heartbeat, Kira felt the sharp sting of them like salt ground into a fresh wound. But then a strange calm settled over her, cooling the rage that had begun to spark in her chest. She pushed off the locker, standing straighter than she had since stepping into this school, and met Lauren's gaze unflinching, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the hallway's stale stillness like a bell. I'm not going anywhere. And with those four words, something shifted in the air, an almost imperceptible ripple that passed through. The watching students who had gathered like moths drawn to the glow of conflict, their eyes widened, their breath caught, as if they realized the old rules might not apply anymore. Lauren's mask cracked ever so slightly, her lips parting as she searched for something to say, but the practiced retort she had honed over years of dominance seemed to evaporate like morning mist under a rising sun. Cassidy shifted awkwardly at her side, the faint scent of bubblegum wafting from the snap of her chewing gum, mixing with the sour tang of teenage sweat hanging heavy in the corridor. Eliza's eyes darted between Kira and Lauren, uncertain flickers of doubt painting her features in pale strokes. And in that taut silence, Kira realized she had finally found the strength she'd nearly lost to fear, a strength born not from the desire to hurt or win, but from the quiet certainty that she would never let someone else decide who she was or where she belonged. The second bell rang, shrill and piercing, reverberating through the hall like a starting gun, breaking the tension and scattering the watching crowd into motion as doors slammed open and teachers stepped out to herd their students into class. The thrumming of hurried footsteps rose around them, but the world felt frozen as Lauren stepped back, her eyes narrowing into slits as she realized this battle wasn't ending the way she wanted it to end. Her voice dropped to a hiss that barely rose above the rush of bodies, but Kira caught every syllable. Don't think this is over. And in that promise hung a storm waiting to break. But Kira simply turned, walking toward her next class, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted each step deliberate as the tide of students parted around her. Some faces wide-eyed with awe, others hidden behind hastily averted gazes. And for the first time since she arrived, Kira felt something like power flicker in her chest, a warmth spreading through her veins, stronger than fear, deeper than anger, because she knew the war had only just begun, but this time she wouldn't face it from the shadows. She would stand in the light unbroken, unbowed. The classroom buzzed with the restless energy of students settling into their seats, the squeak of chair legs against linoleum like tiny screams in the tense hush, as Kira stepped inside her damp, stained shirt, drawing every flicker of attention. Like a spotlight, she walked past rows of staring eyes, the acrid scent of cleaning solutions still lingering faintly from the janitor's rushed mopping of the hallway, drifting into the room with her, as if the whole building carried the echo of what had just happened. Whispers flared and died in the same breath, every mouth hungry for gossip, but afraid to speak too loudly, afraid that the fragile new order might snap with a single word. Kira slipped into her seat at the far back corner, the one place that felt almost safe, her fingers curling around the edge of the chipped desktop, the metal cool and grounding beneath her shaking hands. She kept her gaze steady on the whiteboard, ignoring the sideways glances that cut into her like shards of glass, but each time her eyes flicked up, they met curious stares that darted away just as quickly, as if everyone was trying to figure out whether the stories they'd heard in the hallway were true, whether the quiet girl really was the one who had stood toe-to-toe with Lauren Cross and not only survived but sent her slinking away. In shame, the teacher cleared his throat, a thin, balding man with an easy voice that cracked faintly as he called the class to order. But even his presence couldn't fully erase the invisible tension humming through the room. Kira's thoughts twisted with every ragged breath, memories of Lauren's words replaying like a broken record, each syllable sharp and heavy, pressing down on her chest. But through the fear pulsed a small, steady certainty, like a candle refusing to gutter in the wind, that she wouldn't be broken. Not this time, not here. Her mind flashed back to mornings in her father's gym, the smell of sweat and old leather, the soft thud of fists against punching bags, the rhythmic slap of jump ropes against concrete. Her father's voice low and patient as he taught her that strength wasn't about how hard you could hit, but about how long you could stand. The teacher's droning voice blurred in her ears. the words rolling over her without meaning. As her eyes flicked to the clock, the second hand crawling across the face with agonizing slowness. Each tick a reminder that soon the final bell would ring and she'd have to step back into the hall where the fight wasn't over, where every corner might hide another ambush, every shadow a place for whispers to grow louder. Kira wondered if the others in the class felt the same crackle in the air, the subtle shift in the unspoken hierarchy of the school. The knowledge that the old queen might not be as untouchable as she seemed. She caught a glimpse of Jonah Briggs, a tall, lanky boy with nervous eyes who had always kept his head down in Lauren's presence. His gaze flicked to hers wide with something like gratitude, and in that fleeting look, Kira saw the ripple of change beginning to spread, small but real. As if by refusing to break, she had given others permission to hope for something different. The smell of pencil shavings and stale gum filled the air, a strange comfort in its ordinariness. And as the teacher moved on to the day's lesson, Kira forced herself to focus on the words on the board, each letter and anchor pulling her back from the whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. But her mind never stopped scanning the room, the itch at the back of her neck telling her that even if Lauren wasn't here, someone might try to finish what she started. The bell finally rang its shrill clang, slicing through the low hum of the room, sending students scrambling for their bags, the scrape of binders and rustle of paper filling the air. Kira stood carefully slipping her backpack over one shoulder, her eyes locked on the door as she prepared to navigate the gauntlet of the hallway again. But as she stepped outside, the corridor felt different. The conversations didn't die when she passed. Instead, they seemed to part around her, the chatter fading to a hush, then rising behind her like a wave. The smell of floor wax mixing with the faint perfume of passing students, and somewhere deeper under it all, the sharp electric scent of tension rising off skin like ozone before a storm. Lauren stood further down the hall, her back to the lockers, Cassidy and Eliza at her side, their eyes darting restlessly as they took in the shifting tide around them. Lauren's gaze fixed on Kira with a hardness that looked almost brittle. Now a layer of desperation creeping into the corners of her perfect mask. Kira walked straight toward them, refusing to slow her pace, her pulse hammering against her ribs, each footstep echoing off the walls louder than the murmur of onlookers who hovered in small groups at the edges of the hallway. Lauren's eyes widened a fraction, just enough for Kira to see the tiny crack in the armor, the flicker of uncertainty she had planted in the cafeteria and nurtured with every calm step since. And that glimpse fueled Kira's resolve. She stopped inches away, the scent of Lauren's expensive floral perfume cloying in the heavy air. And for a moment, it felt like the entire world balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for one of them to speak. Lauren opened her mouth, but her voice faltered. The words caught in her throat like glass shards. And in that fragile beat of silence, Kira realized something important. Lauren's power had never been real. It had always lived in the fear of others, the quiet consent of a school that let her rule because no one dared to challenge her. And now that fear was splintering around them like a mirror dropped on concrete. Lauren finally found her voice thin and sharp. "I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are," she hissed. But even as she said it, the words rang hollow, falling flat against the charged silence like pebbles thrown into a storm. Kira leaned forward just enough that her low, even voice carried to Lauren alone, her eyes never blinking. "I'm not afraid of you, and you should start being afraid of me." Her words rolled out soft and steady, but they struck like a hammer, every student leaning in to catch each syllable, eyes wide with the unthinkable realization that the untouchable queen had just been openly defied. Lauren recoiled as if slapped. Cassidy's lips parted in a silent gasp. Eliza shifted back half a step, uncertainty flooding her eyes. And in that moment, the last illusion of Lauren's control fractured the hallway away, buzzed alive with whispers, a shiver of excitement and fear rippling outward like a shockwave as Kira turned on her heel, walking away each step firm and quiet, but leaving behind a roar louder than any scream. The moment Kira's footfalls carried her past the final rows of lockers, the hallway seemed to inhale sharply. The eyes that had followed her every move now swung back to Lauren, whose rigid posture cracked beneath the weight of silence that felt heavier than any shouted insult. The electric hum of the overhead lights pulsed like a heartbeat, the scent of metal and old dust rising as if the school itself had been holding its breath. Lauren's throat bobbed once, twice. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged, and in that vacuum of noise the truth settled over everyone, like a suffocating fog that the queen had been dethroned, not by force, but by a quiet, unwavering defiance. Cassidy's hand fluttered up to touch Lauren's arm as if to steady her, but Lauren jerked away, her eyes wild and unfocused rage and disbelief battling for dominance. In the glint of blue that once froze hearts, now unable to land on a single target, whispers turned into small cracks of conversation bouncing off the lockers, like ricochets, every word carrying the same question. Did you see that? Could it really be over? Was Lauren finally done? The faces of freshmen and seniors alike peered from doorways and corners, half afraid, half thrilled, to witness what they'd always dreamed of, but never dared to believe possible. Kira walked down the hall like a phantom, immune to the storm rising in her wake, each step unhurried, yet full of a silent purpose. The musky smell of old sweat drifting from the gym mingled with the sweetness of someone's spilled soda, sticky on the floor near the water fountain. The chaos behind her swelled, voices rising as students pressed closer to Lauren, who stood frozen, her mind clawing desperately for the old threads of power that had always felt so sure in her grasp. Eliza's eyes darted nervously between Lauren and the onlookers, her voice shaking when she finally whispered, "Maybe we should just leave," but Lauren's spine snapped straight like a puppet, yanked on its string, her head whipping around to glare at Eliza, the fury of a wounded animal spilling across her features. The crowd pulled back ever so slightly, startled by the sudden crack of Lauren's rage. But it was a brittle sound, lacking the depth it once had, as if everyone could feel the emptiness behind it. Kira slipped into the next corridor, her mind racing despite the calm mask on her face. Images of Lorna's eyes widening, of the cracks, spidering across the queen's perfect armor, replayed like a loop, feeding a flicker of triumph that felt alien and dangerous. But underneath it, a gnawing fear pulsed. What happens next? Will this really end here? Or will Lauren find some new way to strike back? The air felt thick, heavy with the tang of teenage sweat and cheap cafeteria fries drifting from vents overhead. As Kira passed the trophy case gleaming under fluorescent light, she caught a faint reflection of herself. Dark eyes steady, jaw set, a quiet figure walking alone in a school that had turned into a powder keg in a single afternoon. Her chest tightened, memories of nights in Chicago where sirens wailed like hungry wolves, and she learned to walk home fast without looking back, rising unbidden as if reminding her that survival wasn't always about fighting, but sometimes about knowing when to vanish. But she couldn't vanish now. Not when every step forward meant others might finally see the cracks in the walls that they'd been told were unbreakable. In the corner of her eye, a small group of kids, usually silent and forgettable, clustered together, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with something like hope. One of them, a boy with frizzy hair and bitten nails, caught her gaze for a heartbeat, his lips parting as if to speak, but words failed him, replaced by a quick nod so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Kira saw it, felt it like a secret handshake passed between the tired and the brave, a tremor of solidarity that gave her spine new steel ahead. The library doors loomed tall and dark, the scent of old books seeping. Through the crack, Kira hesitated, her hand on the worn brass handle, heart pounding in her ears, each thud echoing the questions that spiraled louder. Could she really do this? Could she keep standing tall? If Lauren tried again, or would the weight of every eye watching finally crush her resolve? She pushed the door open, the cool, musty air of the library washing over her like a balm, the hush inside almost sacred compared to the riotous energy pulsing through the halls behind her. The rustle of pages, the soft hum of computers, a sanctuary of order, in a world that felt moments away from tearing itself apart. She slipped into an aisle between tall bookshelves, breathing deeply, the scent of ink and aging paper, grounding her thoughts. She let her fingers trail across the spines of novels, arranged like soldiers in endless formation. Each one a silent promise that stories could end differently than they began, that people could change, and so could the worlds they inhabited. In the quiet shadows of the library, she allowed her shoulders to drop, her breaths to even out, the adrenaline ebbing, as the whispers outside continued to swirl like storm clouds battering the windows. But for the first time, she let herself believe she could face what came next. The librarian, an older woman with kind, tired eyes, glanced up from her desk, her gaze lingering on Kira with a silent question. "Are you okay?" But Kira just nodded, offering the smallest grateful smile before slipping deeper into the stacks, hidden for a precious moment from the storm that was still building beyond the library doors, a storm that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Her mind ticked through the possibilities. Lauren could lash out more vicious than ever, her friends could close ranks, or worse, the school administration might step in, framing Kira as the cause of chaos instead of its catalyst. each thought a jagged stone in her chest. Yet beneath them, a quiet, steady voice insisted there was no turning back. Not now. Not after everything had already changed outside the library. A bell rang sharp and metallic, jolting Kira from her thoughts. The soft creak of chairs scraping across tile carried through the walls as students gathered their things to move on to the next class. The roar of hallway chatter swelling anew like the ocean surging after the pull of the tide. Kira exhaled slowly, letting the sound wash over her. Not as a threat, but as a reminder that she was still here, still standing even as the world shifted under her feet. The library doors swung shut behind Kira, with a dull finality sealing her off from the roar of the hallways for just a moment. But even here, the walls seemed to hum faintly with the rumors spreading like wildfire outside each muffled voice. A ripple carrying her name, and Lauren's 1,000 versions of the truth born from a single defiance. The scent of old varnish and floor polish thick in the air, grounding her in this quiet space as she slipped between rows of towering bookshelves, their spines lined up like silent sentinels, watching over her every hesitant breath. Kira's steps slowed her, sneakers squeaking on the worn linoleum floor. In the hush of the library, she could almost believe she was invisible again. Just another girl hiding among stories where bullies were vanquished and quiet strength won the day. But the reality waited beyond these pages, coiling tighter. With every passing minute, she could feel it in the itch beneath her skin, in the way her heartbeat refused to settle, as if her body knew the peace was only borrowed time, and soon the storm would find her again. The librarian glanced up once more, her eyes soft but weighed down by the knowledge that even the safest places can't hold back the world outside for long. Kira traced a finger along a row of books, feeling the uneven texture of embossed titles catching on her skin, a reminder that life wasn't smooth either, that each scar, each raised edge told a story she wasn't sure yet, if hers would end in triumph or in another painful departure. Like the schools before a soft scrape of a chair sliding back from a table drew her gaze, and for a split second she feared it might be Lauren's minions come to finish what they'd started. But it was just a boy in a faded hoodie, glancing up with wide eyes, his face pale as he recognized her, his breath catching in his throat before he quickly looked down, pretending to study the open book before him, his shoulders hunched as if expecting the walls themselves to scold him for. Meeting her gaze, the air between them vibrated with unspoken questions. Would he spread what he saw? Would he become another voice adding to the chorus outside, or would he carry this quiet moment of shared fear and let it bloom into something softer? This heavy smell of toner and warm electronics drifted from the nearby computer stations, the distant whir of a printer punctuating the silence as Kira ducked into a narrower aisle, letting the shadows swallow her. She pressed her back against the bookshelf, eyes fluttering shut as the murmur of the outside world pushed at the library walls like a rising tide. She wondered if it was foolish to hope this single act of defiance would change anything, or if it would only make the days ahead more dangerous. Each possibility knotted her thoughts tighter, yet, in the center of the storm, a small, steady flame of determination flickered. Refusing to be smothered, the intercom crackled overhead, a teacher's voice breaking the spell, announcing the next class. Rotation. But the words blurred in Kira's ears, overshadowed by the memory of Lauren's face, pale and trembling, eyes darting like a cornered animal. The queen who had ruled these halls unchallenged, now forced to confront the truth, that her power wasn't as absolute as she believed in. The spaces between the teachers' clipped syllables. Kira thought she heard the echoes of her father's voice, quiet but fierce. The lessons of control, of balance, of never striking first, but never letting herself fall. She wondered what he would say if he could see her while. Would he tell her to stay silent and safe, or would he remind her that sometimes survival demanded a stand? The light overhead flickered briefly, casting the rows of books in stuttering shadows as if the building itself shivered with anticipation. Kira inhaled the dry scent of old paper, letting it fill her lungs until the pounding of her heart began to slow. Her mind replayed the faces of classmates whose eyes had held something new. Not just fear or pity, but a spark of understanding. Could it really be possible that in challenging Lauren, she had shown them another path, that maybe strength didn't have to look like cruelty, that maybe silence could be power when wielded by someone unwilling to break? The muffled thud of a book dropped somewhere deeper in the library made her jump, muscles tensing as adrenaline surged, but it was only the boy in the hoodie, fumbling his backpack, eyes darting nervously in her direction. Kira's breath shuddered out in relief, though the heat in her cheeks betrayed how raw her nerves still felt. She forced herself to step forward, moving through the labyrinth of shelves, the thin carpet worn thin in spots from generations of students pacing these same aisles, searching for answers, or simply for a place to hide outside the library. The muted thunder of feet in the hallway grew louder, punctuated by sharp barks of laughter and the squeal of metal locker doors slamming open and shut, each sound a reminder that time was slipping away and soon the quiet haven would be breached. The boy in the hoodie hurried past her, eyes still fixed on the floor, his retreating steps leaving behind a heavy silence filled only by the low hum of the ventilation system, stirring the stale air. Kira's thoughts tumbled over themselves. Could she really stay here forever, hidden among words? Or would she have to step back into the storm? And if she did, would she find herself alone? Or would those new sparks of respect she glimpsed ignite into something stronger? The brass clock above the library entrance ticked loudly, each second carving deeper into her resolve, reminding her that choices once made couldn't be unmade, and the world beyond these walls would not wait for her forever. With a final deep breath, she straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the aisle into the pale afternoon light, filtering through high windows. The librarian looked up again, her gaze steady as if saying without words, "You're stronger than you know." And Kira offered a faint nod in return. The doors loomed ahead, heavy and solid, the last barrier between her fragile peace and the maelstrom beyond. But this time as she pushed them open, the fear still curled tight in her gut felt smaller. Out there, the rumors were still spreading, the crowd still restless, but something in the air had changed, a fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, this fight wasn't hers alone to carry anymore. The hallway beyond the library doors pulsed with a low, restless energy that felt alive, whispering secrets through every locker hinge and bouncing off the scuffed tile floors. Kira stepped into that current, shoulders squared, feeling every gaze like a pinprick on her skin as the quiet between classes stretched thin as gossamer threads. Students parted in slow waves as she walked, not out of respect, but from a raw uncertainty that shimmered in their eyes, a silent acknowledgement that the old rules had been broken, that the unspoken lines of power were blurring with every step she took. The sharp chemical tang of the floor cleaner lingered in the air, mixing with the faint metallic scent of locker doors clanging open and shut, punctuating the hush with quick staccato beats like a broken drum line. She caught sight of Lauren's friends clustered by the stairwell, their eyes wide with unease as they whispered urgently, heads craning to follow Kira's movements as if tracking a ghost that refused to fade. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a harsh electric whine, casting pale, sterile light on faces caught between curiosity and fear. Shadows moving like nervous animals across their features. The rhythm of the school had shifted into an off-kilter syncopation, and everyone felt it, even if they didn't yet understand why the voices were lower now. More cautious, yet carrying further like ripples on a still pond, the questions weaving through them all. What had happened to Lauren? Why hadn't she struck back? What did it mean for the rest of them in the corner of her eye? Kira noticed a tall boy from her homeroom, eyes flicking quickly from her face to the floor and back again, before he straightened just enough to give a small, respectful nod, the gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the faint flutter of warmth it sent through her chest, a momentary glimpse of the possibility that standing firm had already begun to shift the tides. Kira's breath stilled when she finally saw Lauren emerging from the girls' bathroom, her face pale as moonlight, hair disheveled, a haunted glaze, clouding eyes once bright with arrogance. The scent of cheap perfume and hairspray lingered in a sharp cloud around her, as if it alone could protect her fragile throne. But it only made the emptiness in her eyes more stark. Lauren paused when she saw Kira, the two girls locked in a gaze so heavy it seemed to warp the space between them. Lauren's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The silence so deep, even the rustle of a paper flyer fluttering to the floor echoed like a shout. The crowd stilled, sensing the rawness of the moment, breath held in collective suspense, waiting for the explosion that had always come before, but this time it didn't come. Lauren's eyes darted around, wild and lost, searching for her friends, but Brielle and Sienna, who had always hovered close, were now lingering steps behind, caught in their own whirlpool of fear and confusion, as if they too were rethinking their place in this hierarchy that had defined their everyday. Kira felt the burning question rising inside her. Would it be enough to stand here unbowed, or would she have to step forward one more time to end this, to make it clear that there was no path back to the old order for Lauren or anyone else? The air was thick with the oily smell of sweat and nerves, the hallway pressing close with every watching student who dared not speak, yet hung on every breath. Lauren's hand rose as if to point to Kira, as if to summon the words that would call back her power. But her fingers trembled, then dropped helplessly to her side, her shoulders sagging with the crushing weight of a fear she could no longer mask. The buzz of the lights flared briefly, a shrill crackle that made some flinch, the only sound in a silence so heavy it was almost holy. Kira took a single step forward, eyes steady, voice low but clear enough to reach every ear. "You don't have to keep fighting this, Lauren, but I won't run," the words cut through the hush ringing in the air long after they'd been spoken. Lauren's breath caught, eyes widening as the truth of her own defeat spread across her face like a stain. She looked down at the floor, lips trembling, a sharp gasp escaping her throat as the first tears slipped free, glittering in the sterile light, like shards of broken glass around them. The tension bled out of the crowd, slow and uncertain. Yet palpable shoulders relaxed, cautious breaths exhaled. A girl in a plaid skirt leaned into her friend, whispering, "Did you see that? She didn't even have to lift a hand to win." Kira's heart pounded with a hollow echo, the adrenaline still burning in her veins. But deeper than that was a quiet, rising certainty that she had crossed a line she could never step back from. She wondered if it would last, if this fragile shift would survive the next rumor, the next petty cruelty, or if she'd wake up tomorrow to find the old order snapping back into place like a rubber band stretched too far and suddenly released. The bell rang sharp and cold, shattering the moment into a rush of footsteps and laughter as students flooded the hall, sweeping past the two girls who remained frozen in the center of the swirling chaos. Kira exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past days begin to slip from her shoulders, even as she knew the road ahead would not be simple or smooth. Lauren's friends hesitated near the stairwell, eyes darting back to their fallen queen before they melted into the crowd, their absence leaving Lauren truly alone for the first time. The smell of hot asphalt drifted through an open window as a bus hissed to a stop outside its doors, folding open with a sigh. The world outside moved on, indifferent to the battle that had just ended. But inside the building, everything felt different, and the electric question flickered in every mind. Who would they choose to be? Now that they'd seen power undone without fists, without shouts, but with a quiet, unwavering resolve, Kira stepped past Lauren, not with triumph, but with a calm acceptance that the storm had passed for now. And as the hallways emptied behind her, each footstep echoed with the promise that the old Meadow Ridge High was gone, and something new was finally possible. The air outside Meadow Ridge High was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and warm asphalt, radiating heat beneath a pale blue sky streaked with thin white clouds that drifted slow and indifferent overhead. Kira stepped out of the double doors, feeling the heavy quiet settle on her shoulders, like a weighted blanket as she crossed the cracked concrete walkway past small knots of students who fell silent mid-sentence when they noticed her, their eyes wide, uncertain, darting away almost as quickly as they met hers. The chatter resumed in hushed, uneven spurts behind her, like the cautious whispers of a crowd that had just witnessed something they couldn't quite believe. The faint squeal of the old yellow bus brakes rose over the low hum of distant traffic, a sharp metallic cry that made Kira's ears ring for an instant, reminding her how alive her senses felt. After everything, the sharp smell of diesel mingled with the acrid tang of fear still lingering on some faces as the crowd began to thin. Kira spotted the shape of a figure lingering near the bike racks, a lean silhouette partially hidden by the long shadows cast by the afternoon sun. It was Avery, his tousled dark hair falling over eyes that were fixed on her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, he looked like he was about to step forward to call her name, but hesitated, his lips parting just enough to show the question. Burning there, did he really know her? Did he understand what had just happened? Or was he one of those who would keep their distance now that she had shown she would never bow again? Kira kept walking, the crunch of gravel under her worn sneakers loud in the quiet. And for an instant, every little sound felt amplified. The rustle of leaves overhead, the distant barking of a dog, the sharp chirp of a lone bird cutting through the afternoon stillness. She wondered if Avery would step up, if he would break the silence with his voice. But he stayed rooted in place, as if caught between fear and admiration, his eyes following her with a strange yearning that twisted something deep inside her chest. A small part of her wanted to run to him, to feel his steady warmth, to find comfort in arms that had once felt like home. But another voice, sharper and colder, reminded her that this wasn't the end of anything, only the start of a new fight, The crowd finally thinned until the school steps stood empty and silent, the doors swinging shut behind her with a soft echo that carried across the empty parking lot like the last sigh of an old ghost. Kira paused at the curb, her reflection shimmering in the oily rainbow film, floating on a shallow puddle at her feet, the image fractured and whole all at once, showing a girl she barely recognized, someone stronger, someone who would never again shrink from a challenge. She felt the question rise sharp and bitter. Would she have the strength to stay this way, or would the old fear creep back in when the days grew longer and the shadows deeper? The breeze shifted, carrying the faint smoky scent of distant barbecue and the sticky sweet perfume of late-blooming honeysuckle, a smell that reminded her of long summer nights in the city before everything went wrong, before every step outside her door felt like a gamble with someone else's cruelty. Her father's voice echoed unbidden in her mind, low and resolute. Don't let anyone decide your worth, Kira. She clenched her fist, the memory of his warm, steady hands on her shoulders, both a comfort and a spark of determination as she stepped off the curb and walked across the cracked asphalt, feeling every eye, even the hidden ones on her back. The afternoon sun beat down hot and relentless, but she welcomed the sting on her skin, a reminder she was alive, present, unbroken. Each breath she drew felt like a quiet victory, every step a promise to herself that she would never again be the quiet girl, willing to fade into someone else's shadows. She reached the far side of the parking lot where a row of trees cast cool shifting patterns across the sidewalk and paused to look back. The school building loomed red brick and dark windows, blank and watchful, like the face of an old enemy now stripped of its power. The sense of finality rolled through her like distant thunder. She knew there would always be those who whispered, who doubted, who clung to the old ways. But they would never again see her as an easy mark. The faint, metallic taste of old fear lingered on her tongue, but she swallowed it down her chin, lifting her gaze, sweeping the school grounds with a calm defiance. A soft rustle of fabric broke the quiet. Avery was there at her side, his steps hesitant yet sure, his voice low but clear, as he asked, "Are you okay?" Kira almost laughed, a sound that felt like the first crack of dawn, breaking across the night because okay wasn't the right word. It was too small, too simple for everything she felt right now. But she nodded, meeting his worried gaze with steady eyes. "I will be," the words tumbled out quiet but fierce, leaving Avery blinking as if he had glimpsed something wild and untamed in her eyes. He reached for her hand, fingers brushing her knuckles, but stopped inches away, the space between them, heavy with all the things neither of them could yet say. The sky overhead deepened to a soft lavender as the sun slipped lower behind the rooftops, turning every window to a pool of molten gold. The world around them shifted with each lengthening shadow. But Kira stood firm, her feet planted, her breath, even her heart, a steady drumbeat. In the silence, she felt the questions in the eyes of those watching from the far edges of the lot. Would she rise or fall? Would she stay strong or crack under the weight of what she had done? But she already knew the answer. The answer was in the way the air felt lighter around her, in the way the silence no longer pressed like a threat, but sang with the quiet promise of freedom. The last school bus pulled away, its engine rattling into the distance, leaving the lot empty. But for a few stragglers who looked at Kira as if seeing her for the first time, she exhaled the knot of tension in her chest, unwinding just enough to let in the sweet, smoky dusk, the faint scent of crushed grass underfoot, a reminder that this was only the beginning. The weight of everything still ahead pressed against her shoulders, but instead of bending her, it settled like a cloak of quiet strength. She turned toward the road home, feeling the certainty bloom deep in her chest, like the first stars winking awake. Against the purple sky, she was no longer a girl waiting to be saved or ignored. She was the one who would write her own ending. The walk home felt like stepping through a world newly born in pale twilight, where each breath carried the lingering sweetness of cut grass and warm pavement, slowly cooling beneath her worn sneakers. Kira moved with a calm deliberateness, the rhythmic scuff of her step mixing with the distant hum of cicadas rising in the dusky air. Her mind flickered between sharp flashes of the afternoon's confrontation and the softer memories of a time before she knew what it meant to stand alone. Her father's old station wagon still sat in the cracked driveway of their small brick house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its rusting fender catching the last light of the setting sun like a dull bronze mirror reflecting a life she was still learning to understand. She paused on the sidewalk, letting the cool evening breeze slip through her hair. The scent of grilled chicken from a neighbor's yard stirring a low ache in her stomach that reminded her she had barely eaten since morning, but there was something else deeper, quieter, an unease that hovered in her chest like a question waiting to be asked. What if today had changed nothing? What if tomorrow they went back to the way things were? Or worse, what if they found new ways to break her resolve? The thought made her hand clench tightly around the strap of her backpack, the rough canvas biting into her palm. A small pain she welcomed as proof that she was still here, still strong. She remembered the looks on their faces, the wide eyes, the shifting feet, the silent wonder that had spread through the watching crowd after she stood her ground. And a part of her burned with the fear that the respect she saw there could vanish as quickly as it had appeared, that people's memories were as fickle as the wind rustling through the tall maple trees lining the street. Avery's voice drifted back to her unbidden, soft but unsteady, asking if she was okay, if she was scared, if she needed him. The questions a jumble that made her heart ache with a longing she didn't want to name because, even though his concern felt like a balm, she knew this was something she had to finish herself. Old mailbox creaked on its rusted hinge as she opened it. The stale metallic smell rising up like an echo of forgotten letters inside lay only a thin envelope marked with the seal of Meadow Ridge High. The sight of it sent a chill crawling up her spine, a reminder that no matter what had happened that day, there were still rules. Systems eyes that watched from offices and meetings where decisions were made without knowing the truth of what it took to survive. The thin paper felt heavier than steel in her hands. As she slipped it into her pocket, her steps slow, deliberate up the narrow walkway to the front porch, the wooden boards groaning softly under her weight as if whispering their own secrets. The screen door slammed behind her, a sharp clap of sound that echoed through the small entryway, stirring dust motes in the golden light slanting through the kitchen window. Her father's voice called from the living room, low and worn by years of hard work, the familiar rumble sending a wave of warmth and relief washing over her, but also a stab of fear because she wasn't ready yet. Not to share, not to relive every detail, not until she could sort through the tangled mess of rage, triumph, and doubt that still clawed at her chest. She dropped her backpack by the stairs, the soft thunk of books inside reminding her of the normal life she still wanted, a life filled with tests and homework and quiet nights, rather than battles fought in crowded hallways and whispered threats over cafeteria tables. The faint scent of her father's coffee lingered in the kitchen, bitter and comforting as she leaned against the counter, letting her breath slow, letting the day's weight settle into her bones. Each inhale tasted of old linoleum and the faint sweetness of the apple pie cooling on the stove, a tiny piece of normalcy that felt almost fragile in the charged silence of the house. She listened to the steady hum of the refrigerator, the muted tick of the clock on the wall counting seconds that stretched like years as she replayed every moment of the afternoon, the feel of Ashley's rage hot and reckless, the cold rush of clarity as she stepped aside, letting that anger crash harmlessly past her, the quiet hush that fell when everyone realized the old order had cracked if only for a moment. But in that silence, a small, insistent voice rose inside her, whispering that standing up wasn't the same as being free, that tomorrow might bring new traps, new rumors, new ways for Ashley or anyone else to reassert control. And the question pulsed sharp and breathless. What would it cost to keep fighting every single day? Her father's footsteps sounded in the hall, the faint creak of floorboards as he approached, and for a moment Kira thought of running upstairs, locking her door, pretending she had already gone to bed. But then she caught herself remembering the promise she had made in the mirror that morning, that she would never again hide from the things that scared her. His silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall and solid, framed in the warm light spilling from the kitchen lamp. His eyes soft with concern, but edged with the quiet steel of a man who had spent his life fighting silent battles of his own. Kira swallowed the tight knot of fear rising in her throat, the scent of old leather drifting from his work jacket, grounding her as he stepped closer, resting a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder, the weight of it both a comfort and a challenge. He asked what happened, his voice low but sure, and in the space of his question, she felt something shift inside her, a fragile crack opening just wide enough to let the truth spill out. She started halting at first, her words tripping over themselves as she described the taunts, the threats, the moment everything snapped, and she decided she would not break again. Her father listened silent, his eyes dark and thoughtful, reflecting the small, quivering flame of the stove's pilot light. Each word she spoke seemed to burn away a layer of fear, until all that remained was the sharp, raw truth of who she was and what she had done when she finished. A deep silence settled between them, thick but not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that felt like a promise of understanding. She met his gaze steady now, her question unspoken but clear in the air between them. Would he still see her the same? Would he understand his smile, slow but real, creased the lines at the corners of his eyes, his voice a quiet rasp, proud of you, Kira? The words sank into her chest like warm sunlight on cold skin melting away. The last shadows of doubt. She realized then that no matter what the world threw at her, she would never again be alone. The morning broke soft and gray as dawn light slipped like pale silk across the cracked sidewalks of Meadow Ridge, the air cool and damp with the faint smell of wet asphalt, and last night's rain lingering in every breath. Kira moved through the misty quiet of early morning, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the steady scuff of her sneakers the only sound accompanying her down the empty street. Each step echoed faintly off darkened storefronts, shuttered houses, the world not yet awake to the storm gathering in her chest. The final confrontation that loomed on the edge of this fragile calm. She felt every glance yesterday had left behind the weight of whispered rumors, the cold thrill of eyes flicking toward her in the hallways hungry for a show, or perhaps for proof that she was as unshakable as she had appeared in the heat of that moment. The memory of Ashley's rage flared bright and hot in her mind, the twisted disbelief in her eyes when Kira refused to shatter. And that disbelief clung like an oily film over everything. Even the timid morning light couldn't wash it clean. The tall iron gates of Meadow Ridge High loomed ahead, the scent of damp earth and fresh-cut grass rising from the small patch of lawn near the entrance. A sensory whisper of normalcy that seemed to mock the chaos lurking just beyond those heavy doors. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the gate as she passed through the low creak of hinges, sending a shiver racing up her spine. Students milled near the entrance, their voices hushed and uncertain as they watched her approach, as if caught between awe and fear, their faces half hidden in the drifting fog, the shifting shapes of teenage uncertainty. Kira kept her chin, lifted her eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the main building, looming larger with every step. She knew the day would not pass quietly, that Ashley wouldn't slink away into the shadows nursing her wounded pride. There was something brittle, desperate in the way Ashley had looked at her yesterday, a desperate fury that made Kira certain this was far from over. She stepped through the front doors, the stale scent of old textbooks and floor wax hitting her senses, sharp and familiar. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low electric hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones, a strange comfort in its droning consistency. As she passed her locker, she felt the corridor's atmosphere thicken around her, each student she passed falling silent, their eyes wide, following her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Small conversations died in half-finished whispers, the air taut with something unspoken, something that pulsed like a low drumbeat beneath the surface of this quiet morning. Avery appeared near the end of the hallway, his lean frame tense as he threaded his way through the small knots of students, his dark eyes scanning the space with a restless intensity that made Kira's heart skip a beat. When he caught sight of her, he hesitated, his expression a flash of relief followed by a cloud of worry as he closed the distance, his hand brushed against hers, a fleeting warmth that steadied her pulse for a moment. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, strained, carrying all the questions he couldn't speak out loud. She nodded, but the quick flick of her eyes toward the shadows at the far end of the hall told him everything they needed to know. This wasn't over. The faint scent of stale coffee drifted from the teacher's lounge nearby, bitter and grounding, as they moved together toward homeroom. Each step a silent agreement, a shared promise that whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone around them. The school seemed to hold its breath. Even the clatter of a dropped pen sounded unnaturally loud. The tick of the clock overhead, stuttering in its rhythm like a heartbeat, skipping a beat with every second that passed. Then a new sound sliced through the heavy quiet, a sharp, confident laugh ringing from the main entrance, followed by the steady click of heels on polished tile. Ashley emerged from the haze of murmurs, her face set in a mask of icy composure, her platinum hair perfectly arranged, her eyes locked onto Kira, with a burning challenge that made the air feel thin. Ashley's steps were measured, each one deliberate, as if the floor itself bent to her will. The crowd parted like water before her, some students shifting back, others craning for a better view drawn by the magnetism of a showdown. They sensed but couldn't yet name the scent of her expensive floral perfume spread in her wake, cloying and sharp at the edges. And Kira felt the bitterness of adrenaline rising in the back of her throat like bile. Ashley stopped just a breath away, her gaze cutting like glass over Kira's face, as if searching for cracks in the calm that had so unsettled her the day before. A soft hush rippled through the hall, the silence deepening until even the distant buzz of a janitor's buffer machine down another corridor seemed to fade into the background. Ashley's voice came quiet but clear, slicing into the quiet like a knife. "So you think you're untouchable now?" The words dripped with a honeyed malice, each syllable stretched thin and trembling with barely restrained rage, a hint of something desperate in the way her eyes flicked between Kira and the small crowd forming around them. Kira felt the question burn hot in her chest. Would Ashley ever stop? Or was this need to crush anyone who defied her so deeply rooted it couldn't be undone? She forced herself to breathe deeply, the faint scent of lavender rising from her own hair, a reminder of the quiet moment with her father the night before the promise she had made, not just to him, but to herself. Ashley's hand twitched as if she might reach out, grab something, anything to prove she still held power here. But she stopped, fingers curling into a tight, trembling fist at her side. The tension between them crackled so sharp it seemed the fluorescent lights above might shatter from the pressure. Avery's hand shifted closer, not quite touching Kira, but ready, a silent offering of strength. If she needed it, the students around them leaned in, drawn by the gravitational pull of their collision, a ripple of restless energy spreading from the epicenter of Ashley's fury and Kira's unwavering calm. Kira spoke at last, her voice low, but carrying a quiet, fierce strength that cut through the thick hush like dawn breaking through a storm. "You don't scare me, Ashley." Not anymore. Her words fell into the silence, heavy as stones, sending a shudder through the gathered crowd. Ashley's face blanched, a flicker of raw hurt crossing her features, so fast it was almost lost beneath the mask of disdain. But Kira saw it, the crack in the armor, the desperate fear that her power was slipping through her fingers, and she wondered in a breathless beat what Ashley saw when she looked at her. Was it the quiet girl she thought she could break, or something else, something stronger rising from the ashes of every cruel word, every subtle threat? The clock above ticked over. To the next minute, its sharp click echoing like a gunshot in the tense stillness. And in that single sound, everyone knew the war for Meadow Ridge had entered its final phase. Ashley's breath hitched, barely audible, but sharp enough for those closest to hear the sound of a predator realizing its claws had dulled. The soft thud of a dropped binder reverberated down the corridor, amplifying the moment as if the building itself wanted to mark. The instant the power shifted, Kira's eyes stayed locked on Ashley's, refusing to waver, the air thick with the scent of cheap disinfectant and the underlying tension of a school that felt like it was teetering on a knife's edge. Every student stood suspended between the comfort of their routines and the electric promise of something different, something that might break the old rules wide open. Ashley's lips parted as if to speak, but her voice died in her throat, her eyes darting to the faces ringing the hall, hoping to find the familiar nods of support, the eager grins of those who had always delighted in her cruel games. But now the stares meeting hers were cautious, uncertain, some even edged with quiet contempt. Each pair of eyes, a tiny mirror reflecting the truth she had never wanted to see, the truth that her power was only as real as the fear she could inspire. And right now, that fear was slipping like sand through her clenched fingers. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, as if punctuating her faltering grip. On the moment, Kira felt her pulse steady and strong, the whisper of her own breath loud in her ears as she took a single step closer, closing the space that Ashley had always used as a throne. The move was small, but it shifted everything. The hush deepened, so intense the quiet roared in her head as Ashley instinctively leaned back, just a hair barely perceptible, but enough for everyone watching to sense the reordering of the invisible hierarchy that had ruled Meadow Ridge High for so long. Avery shifted beside Kira, the faint scuff of his shoes scraping across the polished tile as he braced himself for what might come, his eyes dark pools of worry and admiration. But Kira didn't need him to speak. The warmth of his presence told her everything she needed to know. The dull drone of the air conditioning unit overhead filled the space between breaths, low and constant, like a heartbeat, reminding them all how alive this moment was. Ashley's chest rose and fell, with quick, shallow gulps, her hands flexing at her sides, knuckles whitening as she searched desperately for a lifeline in the crowd. Her voice, when it finally came, was brittle thin, cracking around the edges. "You think you've won because you embarrassed me." The words fell flat, landing with a dull thud on ears, no longer eager to catch them. The question itself sounded hollow to Kira, as though Ashley was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. A wave of uncomfortable shifting passed through the watching students. Backpacks rustling, shoes squeaking as they shuffled their weight, the subtle sounds layering over each other like the uneasy murmur of a forest bracing for a storm. Kira's mouth tasted faintly metallic. Each word she was about to speak humming in her chest like a live wire. She let them flow quiet, and even each syllable cutting sharper than any shout. I don't care about winning. I care about being free of you, free from the poison you pour into everyone around you. Her voice carried with a quiet authority that seemed to roll down the hallway, stirring something in the hearts of those who had spent too long shrinking under Ashley's shadow. Ashley's eyes widened, a glimmer of panic flashing before it was smothered by rage. Her mouth twisted, the first sign of the mask cracking, and the raw fear underneath clawing its way to the surface. A question throbbed painfully inside her mind. Was this really happening? Could everything she had built collapse so fast, so completely? The faint smell of burnt coffee drifted from the teacher's lounge, a strangely comforting reminder of all the ordinary mornings that had led to this extraordinary reckoning. A soft cough from somewhere behind. Ashley broke the tension for a heartbeat, but only long enough for everyone to lean in closer, drawn like moths to the flame of a truth they hadn't dared to hope for. The edges of Ashley's vision seemed to blur the faces around her, shifting into a swirling sea of eyes that no longer looked at her with obedience or admiration, but with a watchful, dispassionate curiosity. She felt naked, exposed, her armor of confidence dissolving with each second of silence. Kira refused to fill with the weakness Ashley craved. Avery's hand brushed Kira's lightly. A spark of quiet encouragement that grounded her gave her the strength to hold Ashley's unraveling gaze. A low thrum of a distant lawnmower outside buzzed in through the thin glass of a nearby window, the mundane hum mingling with the pulse in Kira's ears, reminding her how real this was, how final each word and movement felt. Ashley's lip quivered, her jaw tightening as if trying to hold back the terror pooling behind her eyes. I made you someone here. Don't you see? She hissed voice. Strangled words almost lost in the heavy quiet, but they reached Kira clear and sad, like a dying echo without me. You're nothing. The confession rang desperate, revealing more than Ashley intended. It exposed the truth to every listening ear that Ashley's need to dominate wasn't born of strength, but of a gaping hollow fear of irrelevance. Kira felt a pang of something almost like pity, but it hardened into resolve as quickly as it came. Her own voice came soft but relentless, each word a blow against the crumbling facade. No, Ashley, you never made me. You only taught me how not to live. The words settled over the hallway like a blanket of finality, the last note of a song that had played far too long and left everyone exhausted but hungry for something new. Ashley staggered back a step, just a breath, but enough that a collective gasp rolled through the watching crowd, a tide of realization swelling in every chest. The queen had fallen, and she had done it herself, the whine of an opening classroom. Door pierced the silence, teachers stepping out, eyes narrowing as they took in the tense tableau. The thin smell of dry erase markers drifting from the open doorway, a reminder that school was supposed to be a place of learning, not this twisted theater. Avery slipped closer, his shoulder brushing Kira's offering. Quiet solidarity as a murmur of conversation finally rippled through the gathered students. Soft, incredulous voices blending into a growing chorus of relief and tentative hope. Ashley's eyes darted wildly, scanning the faces around her, searching for anyone who might still stand beside her. But the faces she found were turned away, shifting uneasily. Unwilling to meet her frantic gaze, her mouth opened, but no words came. Only a strangled breath as she realized she was alone. Truly alone. The second bell rang loud and insistent, breaking the spell, sending students scattering, but not before one last stunned look passed between Kira and Ashley, a silent acknowledgement that the war was over and only one of them had walked away unbroken. The bell's sharp clang lingered in the hall, like the dying toll of a church bell. After a funeral, the corridors came alive with the shuffling rush of feet. Locker doors slammed open and shut. Conversations resumed in hushed, excited tones. But in the narrow stretch of hallway where the final showdown had unfolded, an odd hush still clung to the walls, as if the building itself was reluctant to let go of what it had just witnessed. Kira breathed deep, the stale school air, heavy with the scent of dry erase dust and old floor wax, each breath carrying the weight of a victory she hadn't sought but could no longer deny. The moment felt both endless and fleeting, like a lightning flash that illuminated every shadow, then left the world darker by contrast. Beside her, Avery's eyes flickered with a mixture of awe and fierce protectiveness, his hand hovering near hers, never quite touching, but sending warmth like a beacon through the cold remnants of tension. Their steps fell into quiet unison as they walked. Slowly down the hall, students parted around them without a word, some eyes wide with wonder, others carefully averted, but all aware that something fundamental had shifted beneath the familiar routines of Meadow Ridge High. A new understanding had rooted itself in every mind, and it whispered that power no longer belonged to the loudest voice or the cruelest heart, but to the one who could stand unbroken without needing to break others to feel whole. The electric hum of the overhead lights pulsed in time with Kira's heart, each flicker a reminder that the world around her was still the same, but also irrevocably changed behind them. Ashley's figure lingered at the far end of the corridor, shoulders slumped, head bowed, and as if the weight of her shattered reign pressed down with each breath. Her friends, or what had once passed for friends, hovered awkwardly near the lockers. Brianna's arms wrapped around herself. Courtney staring hard at the floor, neither daring to approach Ashley, let alone offer comfort. As though even proximity to her crumbling power might taint them, the quiet betrayal in their silence was sharper than any word, a realization that made Ashley's eyes glisten with unshed tears, her lips parting soundlessly as she tried to call them back, but found no voice strong enough to pierce the truth hanging heavy between them. She had ruled by fear, and now fear had fled, leaving only emptiness. Kira didn't need to look back to know what was happening. Each step forward felt like breaking free from a chain that had wrapped itself around her life without her noticing. The eyes of the watching crowd lingered longer this time, not with curiosity or caution, but with a fragile, blooming respect. A question trembled in the charged air. Did this mean they too could stand up? Could they too find the courage to break the old silent agreements that kept them small? The answer shimmered faintly in the way Kira's chin stayed high and her shoulders square, even as her legs trembled slightly under the enormity of what she'd done. The scent of warm paper drifted from the library doors. They passed, bringing with it the comforting memory of quiet afternoons spent buried in stories, worlds where heroes rose from the shadows and dragons were slain, not with swords but with unwavering resolve. Kira's chest ached with the thought that maybe real life could hold such moments too, if only she dared to keep choosing courage over silence. Avery's voice, low and steady, cut through the fog of her swirling thoughts. "You did it," he said simply, not with awe or surprise, but with a quiet certainty that made the truth settle deeper in her bones. She did do it not by shouting or swinging fists, but by refusing to bow, by holding her ground until the force of her stillness shattered everything that had kept her small. Kira's breath came easier as they emerged into the courtyard, outside the afternoon sun, slanting low across the cracked concrete, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of the past slipping away. The warmth kissed her cheeks, banishing the last shivers of fear that had clung to her spine. The murmurs of gathered students washed over her. Not malicious, not mocking, but alive with a new energy. Soft, incredulous conversations blooming like the first green shoots after a long winter. Avery moved closer, matching her pace, his hand brushing hers at last, fingers curling around hers with a quiet certainty that said he wasn't going anywhere. The faint scent of cut grass from the nearby soccer field drifted on the breeze, clean and sharp, and full of promise, reminding Kira that the world was wide and open beyond these walls, even if it had taken her too long to see it. Behind them, the doors banged open, a few straggling students hurrying out, casting quick glances back at the building, as if afraid it might swallow them whole again. One boy hesitated near the steps, eyes darting between Kira and the shadowy entryway, before nodding once, a small gesture, but one that felt like a quiet thank you. Carried on the wind, the air crackled with the low hum of possibility. Questions rose unspoken in the minds of those watching. Could they face the small tyrannies of their own days? The whispered slurs, the stolen lunches, the casual cruelties passed off as jokes. Kira's steady steps answered them without words, each stride a declaration that fear could be overcome, that silence could become strength without turning into violence. Avery's voice, again soft but firm, filled the quiet between them. "What now?" he asked the question, warm with hope, but edged with the tremor of someone still catching up to the reality unfolding around them. Kira paused, the sun catching in her hair, turning it to a fiery halo. She breathed in deep, the scent of fresh earth and blooming dandelions rising from cracks in the pavement. Her answer was slow, deliberate now. "We live free," she said. Voice steady but quiet, so soft only Avery could hear. But he understood completely. The words were more than an answer. They were a promise, a vow to herself and to anyone who had watched her stand unbroken, that life would never be the same again. A low whistle of wind rustled through the courtyard, tugging at loose papers and forgotten wrappers, swirling them up like confetti in the golden light. A fitting celebration for the fall of a false queen and the quiet rise of something truer, stronger, kinder. Inside the school, Ashley slumped against a cold concrete wall, breath coming in ragged gasps, tears finally spilling unchecked down her cheeks. The sharp, sterile scent of disinfectant filled her nose as she choked on the bitter taste of her own failure. The footsteps of students hurried past, none slowing to look, none reaching out to help. She felt as though the world was receding from her, shrinking to a pinpoint of loneliness that pulsed with every frantic beat of her heart. In the distance, faint but clear, came the sound of laughter, light and easy, like wind chimes in a summer breeze, a sound that should have filled her with rage, but instead sank deep into the hollow spaces inside her, leaving only emptiness and the gnawing ache of regret. Kira and Avery slipped into the far edge of the courtyard, where the shadows of towering oak trees spread like a quiet refuge, their leaves whispering softly overhead. In a rustling language older than the school itself, the scent of damp moss and warm sunlit bark drifted around them, calming the last tremors of adrenaline clinging to their veins. Kira exhaled slowly, her breath mingling with the cool evening air, and for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed her shoulders to truly relax. The shifting golden light filtered through the branches, painting Avery's face in fractured patterns of shadow and sun, making his gaze softer yet more intense, as he watched her with an expression that seemed to hold every unspoken word they had never dared to voice before around them. The murmur of distant conversations floated like an echo from another world. The courtyard behind them, a hive of restless movement. But here time slowed, the crisp scent of autumn leaves on the wind, hinting at the end of one chapter and the quiet promise of something new. Avery's hand brushed against Kira's fingers, their skin warm where they met, a silent tether, grounding them both after the storm. They had weathered together. He tilted his head slightly, his voice low. "Are you okay?" The words simple but edged with worry, their intimacy making Kira's chest tighten in a way both painful and healing. She hesitated, her lips parting to answer, but the words caught in her throat because how could she explain that she wasn't sure who she was, now that she had stood up, now that she had shattered the silent agreements that had kept her small and afraid? The questions circled inside her mind like a restless bird. Had she lost something essential when she found her courage? Or had she finally discovered the person she was meant to be? Kira met Avery's gaze, seeing the same questions reflected in his eyes, the same raw hope tangled with uncertainty. They stood in that fragile silence for what felt like forever, the air, cool but alive with a kind of electric anticipation. Like the quiet before a summer storm, a flock of sparrows darted overhead, their wings beating in a synchronized dance that made the world feel wild and free. Kira let out a shaky breath, the lingering scent of old chalk and fresh-cut grass grounding her thoughts. She found her voice at last quiet but unwavering. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be now," she admitted, each word tasting sharp and unfamiliar on her tongue. "But I know I don't want to go back to hiding." Avery's hand found hers more firmly this time, their fingers interlacing with a certainty that felt like an anchor. His voice was soft but filled with fierce conviction. "Then don't," he said simply. His words a quiet decree, as sure as any promise. The weight of everything that had happened settled around them. Yet instead of feeling heavy, it felt strangely light, like shedding a burden she had carried for so long. She had forgotten what it meant to live without it. The oak leaves overhead swayed in the wind, their rustling song, a soft applause for the courage she had claimed. Kira's heart beat faster, but not with fear, with something wilder, freer, as if every step she took now could carve out a new path. She could almost taste the metallic tang of possibility on her tongue, a flavor sharper than the bitterness of old fear. Avery shifted slightly, his gaze sweeping the courtyard behind them, where students still lingered in small clusters, their voices a rising tide of speculation and wonder. Some eyes met Kira's and held a moment longer than they once would, curiosity mingling with a dawning respect. A few nodded awkwardly in acknowledgement, silent gestures of solidarity that made Kira's chest ache in the best way, because maybe, just maybe, this was what it felt like to matter, without sacrificing herself to the whims of others, in the quiet space between heartbeats. Avery's thumb brushed over the back of her hand, sending a shiver of warmth racing up her arm, and Kira let herself lean into it, let herself believe for the first time that she didn't have to face everything alone. The heavy door to the main building swung open and a teacher stepped out, clipboard in hand, scanning the courtyard with a look of weary surprise, as though sensing the shift in atmosphere, but not yet understanding what had caused it. His steps faltered as he caught sight of the small clusters of students, their faces turned not toward him as they always had, but toward each other, toward Kira, the unspoken center of a new constellation forming in the quiet aftermath. The teacher's puzzled gaze lingered on her, but he said nothing, moving on quickly, as if reluctant to disturb the fragile balance that had settled over the courtyard. Kira's breath quickened the air, sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and distant city smoke, a reminder of the world beyond Meadow Ridge's gates waiting patiently for her to step into it. Avery squeezed her hand once more, his voice low but steady. Whatever comes. Next, we'll face it together. His words wrapped around her like a shield strong enough to hold back the lingering doubts that tried to claw their way into her heart. She nodded slowly, her eyes catching on the faint reflection of their entwined hands in a puddle at their feet. The image wavered with the breeze but held steady enough to remind her that even when everything else shifted, some things could be unwavering. The low buzz of conversation rose behind them, students drifting away in pairs and small groups, the muted sound of laughter floating across the courtyard for the first time in days. It wasn't cruel or biting, but light, hesitant, like children relearning how to laugh without fear. The sun slipped lower in the sky, turning the clouds into streaks of pink and gold that painted the world in fleeting beauty. Kira watched the colors swirl overhead, feeling the steady warmth of Avery at her side, the rustle of the leaves, the fading heat of the sun, the cool breath of approaching night, all of it wove together into a moment so alive it made her bones ache with the need to keep moving forward, to never let herself be small again. A question glimmered at the edges of her mind. Could she hold on to this courage when the world grew cold again? Could she remember the quiet strength she had found here, long after the whispers faded? The answer pulsed steady and sure, in the way her heart beat in time with Avery's steps, the promise of dawn waiting just beyond the horizon. Kira stepped forward out of the shadows and into the open expanse of the courtyard, where the last of the day's light lingered in long slanting beams that gilded every cracked stone and dust-specked window, framed with a fragile glow. Her breath came slow and deep, tasting of cooling air, and the faint mineral tang rising from the damp earth beneath her shoes. A hush fell across the students still loitering in scattered knots, their voices dropping away as if the world itself leaned closer to hear what would happen next. And as Kira moved her steps deliberate and unhurried, it felt as though the entire weight of Meadow Ridge's old walls pressed in on her, watching her every movement like silent sentinels, wary and curious all at once. Avery kept pace beside her, his presence a quiet fortress that lent her strength, even when the shadows in the corners of her mind tried to whisper of old fears, unforgotten of dark nights, where she had curled in on herself, praying for the morning to come faster. But tonight she wasn't running from the dark, she was walking straight through it. Unflinching, unbowed, a single figure stepped out from the throng ahead. It was Bailey Jensen, the lanky boy with restless eyes who had always trailed behind the stronger, louder kids. His thin frame held taut with an anger he never dared show openly, until now his voice broke the silence, hoarse but sharp. You're not afraid anymore, are you? It wasn't a question, but a declaration, one that seemed to ring through the courtyard with the note of wonder, like he needed to say it aloud to make it real. His words rippled outward, stirring soft murmurs among the others, and Kira paused long enough to look at Bailey, directly catching the shimmer of desperate hope hidden in his gaze, the kind of hope that spread like wildfire once sparked. She shook her head slowly, her voice low but clear as a bell. No, I'm not afraid anymore. The words were simple, yet they vibrated with a power she hadn't known she possessed, the kind of quiet power that made even the oldest stones seem to lean in closer to listen. A wind rose gentle but insistent, ruffling her hair, lifting the scent of damp leaves and old wood into the air, carrying it across the courtyard like a secret message for anyone willing to hear it. The other students shifted uneasily, then began to settle, their eyes flicking between Kira and Avery, as if recalibrating everything they had assumed about who mattered and who didn't, about who they should follow and who they should fear in the hush that followed a girl Kira recognized from science class stepped forward, her chin tilted up in cautious defiance, her voice soft but steady. Can we walk with you? Question hung delicate in the cooling air, an unspoken plea wrapped in fragile courage that made Kira's chest tighten. She glanced at Avery, whose nod was so subtle it might have been a heartbeat. Then she looked back at the girl and managed a small smile. Yes, she said, letting the word stretch out warm and sure, a word that invited not just the girl, but anyone who wanted something different, something braver, something kinder. A word that drew a hesitant, shifting wave through the crowd as more students began to step forward, drifting closer in cautious, hopeful silence. The courtyard was alive with the sound of shoes scuffing against stone, the soft brush of sleeves, the rustle of backpacks shifting as they fell into step beside Kira, and Avery not behind them or ahead of them, but beside them equal and unafraid. The sky deepened to a dusky blue overhead, the first pinpricks of stars flickering awake, as if lighting the way for the quiet revolution unfolding below. Kira's heartbeat steady in her chest, a strong, clear rhythm that matched the rustling breeze, matched Avery's quiet breathing, matched the tentative murmurs of the students now gathered around her. It was a rhythm she could carry forward through every dark hallway, every doubting glance, every time the world tried to press her back into silence and smallness, because she knew now that she was never alone, that courage could ripple out from one steady heart to a dozen more until an entire school began to remember what it meant to look each other in the eye without flinching, to stand together without shame. A question pulsed softly in the back of her mind. Could this new fragile hope survive the grinding gears of routine, the biting edges of old hierarchies and grudges? Or would it crumble like so many other moments of quiet bravery, lost to the tides of gossip and fear? But the answer whispered back clear and unyielding in the warmth of Avery's hand around hers, in the shy smiles flickering across the faces of the students around her, in the hush of the evening that felt like the world itself holding its breath. Yes, it could survive. Yes, it could grow. As they moved together past the darkened doors of the classrooms, where they had all once felt so small, the final bell long since faded into memory, the group expanded step by step like a current, spreading outward, gentle but unstoppable. Kira felt her fear recede like the last shadow of night chased away by dawn. She let it go like a breath she had been holding her whole life, and in that exhale she felt something fierce and bright unfurl inside her, something that could never be taken from her again. The night settled softly over Meadow Ridge High, as the last murmurs faded into the hush of an evening breeze, carrying the cool scent of earth and the faint sweetness of autumn leaves drifting loose from the ancient oaks that lined the empty parking lot, where the echoes of laughter and whispered doubts still lingered between darkened cars, their windows catching glimmers of distant streetlights like tiny floating stars. The courtyard stood quiet now, a space that only hours before had thrummed with unspoken fears and the restless shifting of feet. But in that silence, something new pulsed gently beneath the worn stone, something tender and fragile yet unyielding, as the first shy blades of grass pushing through cracks after a long cold winter. Kira walked slowly, feeling each step stretch out like a sigh, her heart no longer galloping with dread but beating a quiet, steady rhythm that matched the slow drifting of clouds across a velvet sky, and with every breath, she took the weight that had once pressed down on her shoulders grew lighter, until the air around her felt soft enough to float in Avery's hand, found hers warm and sure, and they stood together at the edge of the courtyard, their shadows stretching long and thin across the stone, as if reaching for something just beyond the limits of the old school walls. Stars winked awake, one by one, their distant light brushing the rooftops with a gentle glow. And in that faint shimmer, Kira saw the truth shining clear as dawn. The darkness would always return, but so would the quiet strength she had found within herself, a strength that could carry her forward through all the nights yet to come, whispering with every soft beat of her heart that she had already won simply by refusing to vanish into silence ever again. True strength isn't measured by how loudly we can shout or how many people we can control. It's found in the quiet moments when we stand our ground without losing ourselves in anger or fear, because the courage to face injustice with calm resolve is what breaks the cycle of cruelty and shows everyone watching that power built on fear will always crumble in the presence of quiet, unwavering dignity.